This video is focused on the visual pathway. As in other shows, all the buttons in the show have been disabled. There are three parts to this show. First, the visual pathway, starting from the retina and ending in the visual centers of the cerebral cortex. Reflexes associated with the visual pathway, in particular the pupillary reflex, and lesions that will impact the visual pathway. This represents an overview of the visual pathway showing its various components, starting with the retina, then the optic nerve, optic chiasm, where we have a crossover, and the optic tracts, and the optic radiations, which lead to the visual cortices in the occipital lobe. There is one synapse along the way in the lateral geniculate nucleus, and these elements will be shown in a little more detail on the following slides. So on this slide, we're going to review some of the components of the visual pathway, starting with the optic nerves, of course, each one receiving input from each retina. And the two optic nerves are going to join at a point known as the optic chiasm. The optic chiasm is a location of decussating fibers that are projecting from the retina of each eye. And the important portion of the retina that they're receiving information from is the nasal portion of the retina that will decussate. The next element of the pathway is the optic tract. And the optic tract will course toward the thalamus and end upon a nucleus of the thalamus known as the lateral geniculate nucleus. Here we see the surface feature of that nucleus. It's known as the lateral geniculate body. A few little clinical points here is that very close to the area of the optic chiasm and just posterior to it, we have the infundibular stalk that leads to the pituitary gland, and tumors of either one of those structures can impact those decussating fibers at the level of the chiasm. Just lateral to the optic nerve, optic chiasm, and optic tract region is the internal carotid artery, and an aneurysm of that structure could certainly impact the visual pathway. Here again on this slide, we're going to see the four elements that we saw just previously depicted on this image, starting with the optic nerve, optic chiasm, again where we have the nasal retinal fibers decussating, optic tract, which will then transmit sensory information from the contralateral visual field to the lateral geniculate nucleus, whose surface feature is known as the lateral geniculate body. Note again the close relationship depicted here of the internal carotid artery to the area of the optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract area. Aneurysms of that artery can impact the visual pathway, as well as tumors of the pituitary gland. Here we see the approximate position of the stalk of the pituitary represented here. The following slides will follow the visual pathway using two specimens on each slide, one of a fixed brain specimen and then the other an osmium stain histological slide. So in these two coronal sections of the brain, we can visualize the joining of the two optic nerves at the optic chiasm. And this typically it can be visualized at the point where the anterior commissure is crossing the midline, shown here in this image, as well as when you have the anterior commissure, the part of the internal capsule that is visible here is the genu region. Note that we have the lenticular nucleus shown very nicely on here with its two parts, the putamen and globus pallidus. Posterior to the optic chiasm, now we see the optic tracts starting to diverge laterally, heading toward their destination, which will be the lateral geniculate nucleus. On this image, we start to see some parts of the thalamus present, and right in the midline is and hypothalamus, by the way, and in the midline we can see the third ventricle, which is not labeled, but then you could even visualize the hypothalamic sulcus that separates the thalamic area from the hypothalamic area. Now we're in the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and we can also see a very nice image of the lenticular nucleus and its various subparts. Also in the image here, we can, and not labeled, is the body of the caudate, just above the thalamus there, a little bit to the side of where the thalamus is, but up superior to it is the caudate nucleus. So we'll continue to follow the optic tracts in these two coronal specimens as they diverge further from each other and are approaching their termination in the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Note that the tracts have a fairly close relationship with the crus cerebri, also known as the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain, and that cerebral peduncle does have continuity with the posterior limb of the internal capsule, which we can see very nicely on this specimen, as it lies between the thalamus medially and the lenticular nucleus laterally. The cerebral peduncles or crus cerebri, medial to it or superior to it, you see some nuclear tissue or gray matter tissue, which would be the substantia nigra, which we can see in the stained specimen. It's sort of tannish in color, while in the fixed specimen we see the black pigmentation, and that's due to the presence of dopaminergic neurons contained in that body or in that nucleus. Above the substantia nigra and medially, we have two round bodies and the red nuclei, and just lateral to that are the two lens-shaped structures that we see in the stained specimen, the subthalamic nuclei. Subthalamic nuclei and the thalamus, of course, are part of the diencephalon, while the red nuclei are a component of the midbrain. One last feature is the lenticular nucleus is noted, and below that we see a space that is the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, and in the wall of that, and below that inferior horn, we can see a spiral-shaped structure, sort of a cake roll. Some people call it like a tail of a seahorse. That's the hippocampus. It's located in the medial part of the temporal lobe, and it's a component that is very important in memory, especially recent memory. Well, the optic tracts have now reached their destination, and that's the lateral geniculate nucleus. We can see it nicely in both specimens here. In the fixed specimen, we also can see a little bit of the medial geniculate nucleus. Besides those two main features of the visual pathway, let's just review some of the other features of the brain in the specimen. You can see the thalamus, and laterally the posterior limb of the internal capsule that is continuous with the crus cerebri or cerebral peduncle inferiorly, which is part of the midbrain again. Medial to that cerebral peduncle is the substantia nigra, and medial to that we see a nice round body, the red nucleus, all components of the midbrain. The lower part of the image is sliced through the pons. In the area where we have the lateral geniculate nucleus, especially in a stained specimen, we can see a space below that, and that's again the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, and we see that spiraling shaped structure in this medial aspect of the temporal lobe, and that's our hippocampus. So now we're going to follow some axons radiating from the lateral geniculate nucleus. First of all, let's look at the optic tract on the specimen, the lateral geniculate body, and from there we get the radiating fibers, the optic radiation, which is going to project back toward the occipital lobe and the cortical visual center. Enter those optic radiation fibers. We also, again, remember these structures we can see there, the corona radiata, the area where the lenticular nucleus has been removed. So there is also some internal capsule here that's visualized. And there's a band of tissue above the optic tract there that's coming out toward you. That's the anterior commissure that was seen on the coronal sections very nicely. The optic radiation can be further subdivided into two branches. The retrolenticular branch, which terminates in the cuneus of the occipital lobe, and the sublenticular branch, also known as the Meyer's loop, that projects to the lingual gyrus of the visual cortex. In this specimen also, we can see the presence of the lateral portion of the lenticular nucleus anterior to those two branches. It has not been scooped out, and so that is the putamen we're looking at from this view. And then, of course, these axons that are radiating to and from the cortex above that would be, again, part of the corona radiata that we have seen in other slideshows. Now in this slide, we're going to see the area of termination of these optic radiation fibers in the cuneus and lingual gyrus. Here's the cuneus, and that region of the visual cortex is going to be receiving information mainly from the lower part of the visual field. So here we see a stick figure showing lower limbs and lower trunk. And then in the lingual gyrus, we're going to get the upper part of the visual field, so we see the head and upper limbs illustrated to depict that image of what we may be seeing. So basically what you visualize out in the real world is going to be reversed or turned around 180 degrees once it gets projected back to the visual cortex. And remember, this information came from the contralateral visual field. So this is the right cerebral hemisphere. This image came from the left visual field. This section deals with the pupillary reflex or pupillary light reflex, and it is one of the very important reflexes that is done in medicine, especially if there's been head trauma, to detect whether there is a disruption of the visual pathway, but it could mean that there's other serious events going on, such as hematoma developing in the cerebral hemisphere, in the cranial cavity because of the head trauma. The pupillary reflex, like all reflexes, has a sensory limb and motor limb. And this reflex will have two components, a direct response and an indirect response. We'll first look at the direct response. We shine light in one eye. The receptors in that eye, in this case the right eye, are stimulated. Impulses travel along the right optic nerve to the optic chiasm, then the right optic tract, and that along that optic tract there are collateral branches that come off that will swing around and eventually terminate on interneurons that in the area of the pretectal region of the midbrain that will then hook up with a motor neuron located in the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. This is a parasympathetic cell body in the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Axons from that Edinger-Westphal nucleus will project ventrally and run with the oculomotor nerve as it exits and travel with the branches of that to ultimately terminate in that area 4, which is the ciliary ganglion. From that point, the ciliary ganglion contains postganglionic parasympathetic fibers, and from that point it projects to the sphincter pupillae muscle in the eye, and you get pupillary constriction. The indirect response is also known as the consensual pupillary reflex. By shining light in the right eye, we get impulses traveling around along that right optic nerve, but then at the optic chiasm, some will cross over and travel with the left optic tract and through collateral branches also reach the pretectal area. And that is one option. The other option is that the collateral branch on the right side to the pretectal area hooks up with internuncial or interneurons that cross the midline in the area of the posterior commissure and will then stimulate interneurons that will link up with the Edinger-Westphal nucleus on the left side. And by doing so, will result in a motor limb traveling along with the left oculomotor nerve to the left ciliary ganglion and ultimately to the sphincter pupillae muscle in the left eye, resulting in a consensual pupillary light reflex. So in the next couple of slides, I'll be looking at a case that sort of emphasizes this pupillary reflex. Here we see light being shown into the left eye, and in this patient, the pupil is fixed. It does not constrict in response to the light being shown, and so there is no direct pupillary reflex in this individual. Yet, when we look at the right eye, we see the pupil of the right eye does constrict, and so there is a consensual response in that eye. Now, when right light is shown into the right pupil constricts, meaning that there is a direct pupillary reflex in the right eye. And we note that the left pupil does not constrict. There's an absence of the consensual response when light is shown in the right eye. So where is the lesion? Well, based on our tests, it appears that the sensory limb of the pupillary reflex is intact, but we seem to have a disruption of motor information getting to the left eye, to the left pupillary sphincter pupillae muscle. And here we see, based upon observation, that there is a lesion of the efferent limb to the left eye of this reflex. Being that it's where it's located, most likely it would also involve the other components of the oculomotor nerve. And so most likely this patient would present with ptosis, which is one of the findings of a lesion of the oculomotor nerve, as well as diplopia, which is due to paralysis of some of the extrinsic muscles of the eye, resulting in double vision. The following slides present 4 cases involving the visual lesions of the visual system. A lesion of the optic nerve, left optic nerve, would result in what? This lesion of the left optic nerve would result in total blindness of the left eye. A little question here, little thought question is, what would happen if we shine light in the left eye? Would you get a pupillary reflex, direct or indirect? And what if you shone light in the right eye? The same thing. Would you get a direct or indirect, or both? The second case we have here is a lesion in the area of the optic chiasm. Such a lesion could be due to a tumorous growth of the pituitary gland or the stalk, the pituitary gland, that would impact the optic chiasm initially. So what would be the consequence of this? The lesion of the optic chiasm represents crossing fibers or decussating fibers in the visual pathway, which is receiving information from the nasal portions of both retinae. And those nasal portions of the retinae are getting visual input from the temporal regions of our visual field. So we call this type of lesion the bitemporal hemianopsia, or also known as the bitemporal heteroanonymous hemianopsia, because it's two separate, it involves the right and left side. Some people like to call this a case of tunnel vision. This site of the lesion is of the optic tract, and on the left side, and this could be due to a stroke, could bring this about. There is another possibility, is that the internal carotid artery is near the optic chiasm region and could impact optic tract fibers if there was an aneurysm of that, and it could damage the part of the optic tract and bring deficits related to that too. The consequence of this lesion of the optic tract, being the left optic tract, is that since it's receiving input from the temporal retina of the left eye and the nasal retina of the right eye, those two portions of the retinae of the two eyes are receiving visual input from the right visual field. So basically we have what was known as right visual field blindness, and the technical term would be contralateral, because it's the opposite side of the lesion, homonymous hemianopsia. Contralateral homonymous hemianopsia. Homonymous because it's the same visual field. The term in the previous one was heteroanonymous because there was two visual fields involved, right and left. The last lesion that we see here is a lesion of the cuneus region of the primary visual cortex. And what would be the consequence of such a lesion? The lesion in this cuneus portion of the primary visual cortex results in a deficit which will impact the lower part of the visual field and be just 1/4 of that visual field on the contralateral side. Thus the name contralateral inferior quadrate blindness, or also the term quadrantic hemianopsia. In this type of lesion in the primary visual cortex, not all of the macular region of the cortex is impacted, so we have what is called macular sparing because of overlapping blood supply to the region due to vascular supply coming from the middle cerebral artery and posterior cerebral artery. And thus the image up the top of this cartoon, we see that the blackened area in the center is not filled out because of macular sparing. If the lesion was in the in the retrolenticular branch of the optic radiation, there would be no, in that case, no macular sparing.